Welcome to Utopian Horizons.
Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Utopian Horizons, a podcast where I cover a different utopia, dystopia, utopian thinker or movement in each episode. Yes, if you listen regularly, I have decided to change the intro for something that actually explains what the podcast is for people who haven't heard it before. So there you go. This episode is about a 1992 cyberpunk B-movie called Nemesis. It's a bit different to other stuff I've covered on the podcast, and I do talk with my guest a bit about what might make that interesting. You know, these genre films that have been largely forgotten and sort of found themselves on the trash pile of history. You know, what makes those interesting and what we can get out of those that we can't get from other more well-known stuff. So I will imagine many of you will not have heard of this film or seen it, but I hope you will stick with it and listen to us talk about the movie and some of the interesting themes that come out of that. My guest on this episode is the first returning guest I've had on the podcast. So Sean McTiernan, who came on to talk about Kamikaze 89, has returned to discuss this film. If you haven't listened to the Kamikaze 89 episode and you don't know who Sean is, he does a podcast called All Units, which is about thriller films, which has a very interesting format where he takes a theme, so stuff like uniform or navigation and things like that, and he picks out films that explore those themes in interesting ways. You will hear Sean humbly put himself down a couple of times during the conversation, but his reading of films I think is very insightful and intelligent, and I very much enjoy listening to his podcast, so perhaps you will too if you like this one. So just search for All Units and I'm sure you can find it. Oh, something I meant to say, if you're sort of getting fed up with the amount of cyberpunk I'm covering on this, I'm afraid that's not over yet. There will be more. I'm going to be doing an episode on Strange Days. But just to say, I am wary that I've done a lot of cyberpunk stuff, so I am going to be doing some other things. So the podcast will be getting a little bit more diverse again. One other thing quickly before I get on to the conversation about Nemesis, I've started a Discord, which for anyone who don't know is basically a chat thing. It works, like there's an app for it, but also works in browsers, so it's really easy to get into and use. So there's a few of us in there now just talking about, you know, Utopia and the podcast and stuff. So if you want to come and have a look and talk to me and some other people, please do so. It'd be cool to have some more people in there chatting. I will change the pinned tweet on my Twitter page, so it's got a link to the Discord. So if you just go on the Twitter at Utopian Horizons, then the pinned tweet should have a link to the Discord so you can find it easily. I think that's everything I wanted to cover, so on to my conversation with Sean. Joining me now is Sean McTiernan from the film podcast for people that don't like film podcasts, All Units. He is here to talk about Nemesis. Thank you very much for joining me, Sean.
Hello, I'm sorry for making you watch Nemesis.
It's the second time you've apologised.
I said I'd do it formally. I wanted witnesses. But it's a film I like, but it's not for everybody.
Okay, so this is a film from 1992, directed by Albert Pyun.
I think it's Pyun, I'm not sure.
Yeah, so you probably know more about this guy than me. I presume he's like a B-movie director, essentially.
Yeah, a lot of cult sort of films, a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff, actually. This is the only one I could really remember. But he was definitely called Ed Wood, or the new Ed Wood, because of how poorly people act in his films at one stage. But he's very into like action, I guess, and stunts, and sort of very active in the 80s and 90s. He directed the first Captain America film, like the one from the 80s. And, and he directed, I know he had this very weird, very, very initial career where the legendary Japanese actor Toshiro Mifune tried to get him an internship on a Akira Kurosawa film, but he didn't get it, and he ended up working on a TV show with Akira Kurosawa as director of photography. I only remember that because it's so incongruous compared to the rest of his career. I'd love to tell you there was a clear through line, but there is not. He said himself, I think, at one stage he didn't actually care about the post-apocalypse, which is great. And those were the opportunities he was given. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in it. Sounds like I've only seen Nemesis, but apparently Nemesis is like a series. And the gender stuff that's referred to kind of briefly in this, or that's kind of used to is comes up a lot more. But again, I think he just not pleads ignorance, doesn't really care about that stuff. He just wants to make films, So
yeah, okay. So before we go on to talk about the film specifically, I just wanted to ask if there's any particular reason that you are interested in genre film, because you cover a lot of like genre films on your podcast as well, and if there's anything in particular you think that you can glean, or anything that they reveal that you don't get from other films. I ask that because like I have covered genre stuff on this podcast, but it's stuff that's passed into the canon to some degree.
Yeah,
like it's stuff that's taken seriously to some degree. So whereas this film has a bit where the main character jumps off a pole and they shoot the metal pole and the pole blows up, and a bit where he does a backflip off a waterfall and blows someone up with a rocket. So this is low budget, dodgy impersonations of foreign accents, all the trappings of a kind of B-movie film. And I think it's cool that you've brought something from that world, because it's not something that I've covered. Like even like and we did Kamikaze 89 when you came on before, which is not a well-known film, but that's still it's kind of like a arty film, so it has a kind of air of legitimacy about it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's got Fassbinder in it, right? Yeah, so like that's automatically,
Yeah, so even though this other stuff I've covered, other sci-fi I've covered is from a ghettoized genre, it's kind of broken out from that for some degree, whereas this is firmly in the ghetto. So yeah, I just want to ask if there's any, maybe the answer is you just like genre films, but I just wanted to know if there's anything you found particularly interesting about them, or why you're drawn to them.
Well, I think it's actually, I really like that question, because you've drawn the distinction there between stuff that's passed into the canon and stuff that hasn't, which is actually very rarely done even by people who profess to like genre cinema. There's definitely a tendency to automatically view stuff that has passed into the canon as the best of genre cinema, which I tend not to agree with a lot of the time. I don't think that kind of trappings, like maybe gestures towards mainstream or gestures towards art house stuff are necessarily, the best thing. Like, but part of my podcast is creating kind of a new canon, if you like, actually, for myself, or sort of a school of cinema out of the stuff I like, right? Which is very, very, very egotistical, but it is my podcast. I do pay the hosting, so. But it is very interesting to me that a lot of the stuff, the genre stuff that has been canonized, it's one person. So like Martin Scorsese has this kind of alternate film history series of films that is not as well known now. I think it was like a 3-part series, but every single film he talks in that were sort of the preserve of nerds to some extent, or enthusiasts beforehand, and are now like films that even the casual sort of person who dabbled in cult, especially American cinema, would recognize immediately. So all it takes is like one person. And I don't think I'm going to achieve that, but what I took from that is that individual perspective is very useful when getting stuff out of these genre films, because they are they are product, you know what I mean? All cinema is, but they are consciously made to be consumed. Now, my patience, if you like, or my interest in genre films starts to tail off around the time that a specific type of self-awareness became very, very prevalent, where they became about themselves to such a degree they weren't about anything else. Whereas like previously it wouldn't really work for this show, but I basically at the moment exclusively listen to old time radio, as well as watching, I don't know, I've seen like 90 films this year, and I think 7 were released after 1960, including rewatching this. So I'm very much in the genre crime mode, the first century at the moment, and I find it just reveals stuff about society and is interesting to watch people work, like the actors actually do these things, and there's sort of a kind of a breeziness about it that I appreciate, and it helps balance out the other stuff I watch. And I do think you can definitely, even seeing what people were pretending to care about is always interesting, and there's a lot of that in genre fiction.
I'm thinking out loud, but I wonder, because of the low budgets and stuff, and the kind of slapdash nature of some of those films in some respects. They're like less mediated. I don't know if that's the right word. Like if you're talking about culture, like revealing stuff about society, I think it will come out perhaps more obviously in genre film. I don't know.
Definitely. There's a set of assumptions that genre film operates on that you basically, especially earlier stuff, you just have to fulfill a certain level of requirements, and after that it used to be you could do such weird things. Like if you look at film noir, which people always bring up because it's very easily summarized in a couple of images and a couple of tropes, but it is like intensely, overwhelmingly pop Freudian. The analysis didn't need to happen for it to be that way. It's all there. Literally Freud is mentioned in a lot of noirs and that kind of thing. But even further back, like James Whale, who directed Bride of Frankenstein and the big horror films, I watched one of his films recently, Old Dark House, which sort of brought about the Old Dark House genre, and it would be a progressive genre film today. And in fact, like a lot of that pre-code stuff, it reveals a lot of the culture because they have that shorthand and it doesn't need to feel prestige, if you know what I mean. That's why I think like really, really low budget indie cinema and really almost industrially produced genre cinema can often feel very similar in the end, because people are barely hanging on to the concept of making a film in a lot of cases, and it can often produce very interesting results. That's sort of why I like Nemesis as well. Like I had a sort of a come to Jesus moment, I guess, like maybe 10 years ago when I used to be, I don't know if you know about Mystery Science Theater. Do you know what Mystery Science Theater is? So Mystery Science Theater 3000 is sort of internet nerd culture before internet nerd culture, and I mean that in the most derogatory way possible, right? So they bought the rights to old films, or often they were in public domain, and they created a fictional framework which justified having three silhouettes in the corner of the screen making fun of them. So you'd see these edited versions of films and they would kind of make fun of what was happening on the screen, and they had all these in-jokes and stuff. And I loved this when I was a teenager. Obviously, like we used to buy DVDs from America and spend a lot of money trying to torrent it before broadband existed. And but as I got older, I was like, well, this is like really a shit way to look at films. It's really bad. Even these products, like even something like this, it's not that, you should take it seriously and you should automatically like something because effort went into it. It's that you can glean more from it. And you can still think it's funny, you can still think it's bad, but to kind of create a surface reading of it as a culture, which I think unfortunately a lot of both genre film fandom and also genre films themselves now, like horror is especially bad for reducing itself down to a series of signifiers when it goes into kind of retro mode. So it wasn't Nemesis, but there's another Albert Pyun film, I think it might be Cyborg, that they did a Mystery Science Theater episode on, and it is a very easy film to make fun of in that way. There's no problem making fun of it, but making that the only way to interpret a film is, I realised kind of, when I was about 18 or 19 that was not the best way to go about it. So.
Okay, well let's get on to talking about Nemesis specifically then. I will attempt to outline the world somewhat, because I'm guessing not many people listening would have seen it. So it very much draws on the classic cyberpunk tropes very unsubtly. I mean, it literally, I think the first line or so is laying that out. So it talks about cyborg outlaws and information terrorists and all these classic tropes. I suppose a brief synopsis would be helpful if difficult. So this is about a guy who starts off as a LAPD. Is it LAPD? He's a police officer.
I think it's LAPD. I can try summarize it if you want.
I'll have a quick go because I've written down some notes. So
all right, okay.
So yeah, he's LAPD officer, and at the beginning he's fighting some terrorists. He's already enhanced in some way. He's 86.5% human, as he says when he's questioned by a terrorist to see how human he is. And it's basically a RoboCop-like situation. The first of many references or borrowing from other films, a bit of Terminator in there, a bit of Rambo, perhaps. But yeah, he gets shot to pieces, basically. And then it kind of goes off on a globe-trotting, rather oddly paced plot where it looks like it's going to be a revenge film. Then that quickly ends. And then it's that classic, we need you back, you're the best at what you do. we need you to go on a mission to get some terrorists. That's not the end of the story. I think perhaps we'll get to the rest, but that's probably enough for a setup. Yeah, the first thing I want to ask, which I thought you've already kind of touched on to an extent, is that do you take the surface level concerns of this film like seriously in any way? As in, like, what the narrative presents itself to be about, like this classic kind of post-human cyborg thing?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think it's, again, you know, you're looking at, often the most interesting ideas come out of a basic framework being iterated on over and over and over again, right? To kind of touch on the general genre thing again. And I think Cyberpunk, to me, often feels like this is sort of Cyberpunk as a dead end times a million. You know what I mean? Because it's everything, you know, I've seen this called a rip-off of Johnny Mnemonic, where Johnny Mnemonic hadn't come out yet,
right?
You know? And it kind of proves how, to a certain extent, Cyberpunk and this sort of post-human stuff can be, there's only so many ways to iterate on it in a fictional sense, apparently, you know. But I think it's interesting because they do cover, not in a massively coherent way, but they do cover a huge number of ideas and interpretations of what post-human or enhanced or cyborg actually means, you know. And there's a woman in a calculator or whatever. There's a woman in a USB stick. That's a big part of it. And again, in the sort of honkingly obvious genre film way, she's the most human character of all, or whatever. You know, I know this stuff is cheesy, like, but I do think it is an interesting, and again, the constraints of genre fiction means that, I think I was saying this to you before, that in death, the machineness of the kind of cyborgs and the enhanced people is made most obvious. Now, that's obviously a kind of budget constraint, because it's easiest to make something look like a machine if it's not moving that much, you know, like if it's not fully articulated. But it does mean that, just like in previous genre movies up until that point, where you would have had lingering shots of gore and dead bodies, to turn that into lingering shots of malfunctioning various pieces of wire and stuff is actually, I don't know, I find it kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, as I said, it's not very subtle that it's like dealing with this thing. I mean, when he gets like shot to pieces as being put together, the film repeatedly plays the line, "You're not really human, or are you?" I may have misheard this line, but he says something like, "It always scared me that they might take out my soul and replace it with some goddamn matrix tube," which is an amazingly cheesy line. But yeah, and as you say, like, I'm sort of skipping ahead now, but we can come back to other stuff. But the kind of conclusion that the film has as to what is human is kind of, at surface level in any way, is this conclusion, like, you know what's wrong and what is right, which is really like cheesy and banal, but not as entirely stupid as it sounds, I think. If you think of someone like Philip K. Dick and the way he uses like the android as a metaphor. So there's a non-fiction essay he wrote called The Human and the Android, or The Android and the Human, or something like that, where he basically says that he uses the android. He's not like writing about androids. He uses the android as a metaphor to stand in for like what's not human. And his basic conclusion is like empathy for him is what makes you human. And, you know, androids are people that, you know, they function for a system and enforce the power of that system, and they do not have empathy for what they're doing, which obviously he's someone who's taken this like being philosophically sophisticated in some corners, which that's not a million miles away from you know what's wrong and what is right, which is a cheesy line, but I think has a little bit of truth in it, even if it may seem a little bit silly, if you see what I mean.
Definitely. And I think when the smouldering exoskeleton of the chief robot is trying to throw the hero off a plane at the end of the film, obviously a typical scene in any film, it's really clear to me anyway that the part of what is initially supposed to be human and then is revealed in a twist as is an android, the most advanced android, that is trying to wipe out the human race, that the reason that android is really evil, or the most clear manifestation of what a bad character or antagonist that android is, it has become human. It's supposed to be working for the greater good of its quote-unquote kind, but it's willing to completely destroy and mutilate any member of its kind that is in its way for this kind of abstract idea of the greater good that only serves it, you know, which I think is a big part of it as well. I do think that the definition of human in this, robots are always telling humans they're not human. Robots and androids in this film are always having, like, again, a calculator has a big emotional crisis at one stage. Well, it's a woman in a USB stick, so there's no need to. But what really struck me, actually, the line of the film that probably stayed with me is when they're transferring her data into a thing at this, like, weird, unexplained scene near the end of the film, and she says, "Oh, this is like dying." And the guy goes, "Yeah, but not like humans. Like, you're not even allowed to have your own death." It's kind of like, it's very, the arbitrary divisions keep being made over and over again, and the level to which they're arbitrary. I mean, again, like I said before, I know it's a really small part of the film, but the sort of commitment to giving men women's names and women ridiculous male names, like Max Violence or whatever that character is called, like, who would be like the kind of cheesy woman sidekick kind of thing. That this sort of, look, part of it is because the film is a cheap, weird action film, right? And that it is essentially just a series of bizarre set pieces that were able to be filmed on these kind of rubble sets and whatever. But the arbitrariness kind of seeps into everything for me, and the idea that, are you a terrorist or are you a cop or whatever, and everything like that just gets, it feels very kind of destroys the binary a lot between those two things, and this idea of what is a conscience and do you have it, and is it tied to your consciousness or whatever. It's and
also perhaps unintentionally, because of it being, like you said, these scenes connected by the fact that they're able to be filmed like on the budget and stuff like that, lends it a kind of confusion. There's plot threads that feel like they're going somewhere and don't, and like that sense of confusion, I think, unintentionally helps with like this confusion between like boundaries and binaries and stuff like that, perhaps. So I think one of the most interesting things you said to me when we had a brief conversation about this film is that you think it's really a film about what it means to be a worker. So could you explain that?
I can, yeah. So I think RoboCop is about this cop that gets put back together because it's the ideal, it's almost like interpreted as this is the ideal thing a cop would aspire to be. Of course, part of the satire that it's not. It's what the imagined ideal for a company is, And just like a lot of stuff in this film, because it's a sort of a more visceral knockoff of RoboCop in a way, the guy doesn't even die in an accident. The LAPD just shoots him anyway and says, "Oh, we're going to put you back together because we need you to do something." Like they want you for an assignment. So they literally just kill him, basically, and put a bomb in his heart because, if you're going to put someone back together, why not? But the idea that, like, you're being replaced with more and more parts to make you more durable and and make you more exploitable, like they turn off someone, someone gets their brain turned off in this, or they can track what's coming out of your eyes, or it's I mentioned this as my own podcast, but I think it's really, really struck a chord with me. A Twitter user called Marxian Ergonomics kind of did this thread about how we're like automated trucking and stuff that's happening in factories is not to replace workers. It's become this kind of canard that's trotted out to stop people talking about workers' rights because they can just talk about workers' existences instead. But like what it actually is extraction of labor, right? So they just want you to do more. Like all the stuff that Amazon really does in those warehouses is figure out a way to have more and more of your activities monitored so they can push you to do more stuff. They just want to take more labor out of one person. This is why part of what this film is to me is this guy gets torn apart in the service of whatever he's doing, put back together in, again. And he's literally told, like, we own you. And again, incredibly cheesy, but he's not just talking about him, he's talking about the actual constituent parts he's made from. And, you get these characters that are, somebody says, I want my death to mean something. One of the androids says, I want to matter, I want to do something that will last after me. And, like, all they are at the moment are these tools for these kind of larger corporations, or these, again, like, the politics of this film are, like, the geopolitical landscape is extremely confused. You don't know if you're dealing with corporation states, or you don't know which cyberpunk trope is kind of going on in the background.
I think Japan and US might be one country in this, but I'm not sure.
Oh, finally. Somebody, like, they do start calling people something san at one stage, which is like classic William Gibson Orientalism. That's for some reason a key part of Cyberpunk. But, he says, like, oh, by surgery I became more machine than human. And, he says that and someone's like, he's like, I didn't have any choice, because this is the situation you exist in. And you're kind of accepting as a reality the pressures put on you by the company you're part of, and like the assumptions you have and how you're willing to actually change your body and change your outcome or your aims or your values according to what the people who employ you or the people that basically own you, what they want. So again, it's not the most coherent thing in the world, but it does strike me that again and again, this guy, they put a camera in his eye. And one of the kind of early acts of rebellion or whatever is in an incredibly graphic scene. He gets the camera taken out of his eye. And then, there's characters are shot by other characters because they don't matter because, you're able to justify everybody else as being a robot, even if you're a special one or whatever. But it does seem to me that this idea that people are resources in this, more than anything else. They're, even the chief antagonist was said to be a female cyborg who was completely redesigned to be like the chief of police to replace him, like forcibly. And yeah, it just seems to me again and again is this idea that you're the perfect worker for a company is something that they can extract the most value out of. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in terms of talking about him being instrumentalized, it's important to say, like, even so, like you say, they destroy him and put him back together because they want him to do a job for them. But it has like almost another layer to it because the job they send him to do is not actually what they tell him he's going on a mission to get some stolen data about a meeting between some people about the security plans or something. But they're actually sending him there as like a patsy to like draw out the people they actually want. So it's like he's been produced for a role that he's been sent to perform, and he's not even performing that role that he thinks. He's literally just a tool for achieving another end.
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, even one of the reasons they have him as a patsy is because they want to have somebody that the robot will have an emotional connection with, or the android that they're trying to get will have an emotional connection with, which in itself is really weird, right? So and that's the woman in the calculator. But I mean, even so the action scenes or whatever, and the aforementioned exploding pole all take place in these sort of post-industrial, like recent factories and ruined landscapes and everything like that. And it's even the town Shanglu, I think it's called, which receives one of the weirdest pronunciations of any place in any film from one of the actors. But even that is kind of this sort of outlaw, kind of post-gold rush feeling place, and the idea of being ruined, this lack of empathy and being ruined by technology and everything. You have the most taken out of context because it's funny scene in the film, which a cyber G-man tries to get information off an old woman, and she takes a gun out of her purse and shoots him. And it is incredibly ridiculous, but really cool, I have to say, really bizarre looking, and then completely ruined by the ADR of the star saying, "Oh, Shanglu takes no shit, I like it here," which is a really lame thing to say. Yeah. But even that is like this idea of this kind of post everything cynicism. I think if the film had more money, it would go into that more, but I actually like how austere it is, instead of like iRobot, where they basically have blimps going past. It says people are products, by the way, and make it really obvious that it's sort of implied here by dint of necessity. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, just one more thing on the worker thing. Something that I was thinking of is it's interesting how much of the film is just like stuff happening to him against his will. The obvious thing where they come for him and say, we need you to do this job. We've put a bomb in your heart, so you're going to have to do it. But his attitude is almost like he almost goes along with the mission, like not even, or he almost implies he's not even intending to do it. It's like, well, they want me to go here now, so I'll just get on the plane and do that step that they require of me. And he's just almost like going through the motions. And when he gets there, he's like in his hotel room, and this gang, which we're not quite sure who they are at the time, show up and start beating him up and like interrogating him, and then decide to leave him. And then they pass the terrorists on the stairs who come in, and then he's ended up being choked again by like some. It's almost funny, but like it was a really nice illustration, I think, of the way, even without his desire or intention to like play his role as a worker, the systems are in motion, and it was enough that he's just placed there and things just happen to him, like without, he doesn't have to do anything, these things just happen to him, if you know what I mean.
And I think that's it. Part of that is, again, I don't know why. Well, I do, because it is kind of a very noir in some senses. That happens to a lot of noir protagonists as well, actually. One of the big things to unlock noir films, to me anyway, is it's not about these super competent guys, you know, cutting around and taking everybody apart. It's usually about somebody making the worst series of decisions possible and being very funny or very, you know, tough while they're doing it. But it's somebody's worst chain of decisions they've ever made is usually in noir films. Usually a man, and it's usually just stepping on his dick, basically, is like how noir films work, right? But like, that is like this. And I think partially it's because one of the reasons noir films are like that is a lot of them came out after World War II, in the years after World War II, where you were sent to do something and it was, you know, you were clearly fodder in a certain extent, and then you came back and you were trained to do one thing. That training, to talk again about the worker stuff, and this ties into being genetically enhanced as well. I think the video game Deus Ex, which I am too stupid to play properly, also goes into this. That, you know, you are built, you are enhanced, but you're enhanced to do this one thing. So you have soldiers training, but that training makes you inherently unable to function in large swathes of like normal society, and unable to almost recover from that training. So like a lot of the noir detectives were ex-soldiers. Like that became almost that became like a cliche to throw in. But part of it is because they had this thing locked into them, this ability to navigate in high pressure situations with guns, that doesn't really transfer into starting a butcher shop or whatever, you know, or to be an insurance broker. And that's the same here. Like, this guy feeling of powerlessness and the feeling of being made fodder is, even though he is this perfect physical specimen, he's a French kickboxer, the guy who did it, and even when the camera is like scanning up on him and he has this like crazy, it's an amazing shot, but it's a crazy thing to put in this film, like this kind of Christ pose with him holding a cross and talking about how his, you know, it took him 6 months to put me back together, is over this, you know, him talking about being a robot and whatever, is of him saying it took me 6 months for them to put me back together. It's over this shot of his physicality and his physical training, you know, so there's kind of a twinness there with that. So, you know, you're intensely capable, and I mean, he's doing all of by the end of the film, he's doing all of the action hero stuff. He's literally swinging from vines. I think at one stage. But again, he is, you know, and you could even say, well, part of the reason the acting is bad is because he is able to move in space. That's the talent they have chosen to go with over anything else. And that's what he is able to do. You know, he is a kickboxer. He's able to operate like that. So, you know, you see these moments when the training kicks in, like, you know, my favourite action set piece of the film, where he has to get out of a room, and he does this by shooting through several floors of the hotel he's in to get out of the room. And that's a crazy thing no one would think of, but then that's why he's unable to do simple stuff like maybe don't go over there, maybe don't get beaten up by this gang. You know, like, he is very much trained to do one thing. I mean, one of the robots even says, you know, you're not, when he tries to be a smuggler, and they just cover that by cutting to a year later and him saying, I am a terrible smuggler, you know, basically, like. Yeah,
so it's literally there, like, he literally tries to do something else and he can't do it.
Yeah. And even at the end, like, when he is taking somebody out, you know, he said, oh, you said that I was so bad when I did this stuff on my own that people got hurt. And all he has figured out to do is how to direct that hurt at the right person. So even when he's doing it for himself, he's still acknowledging, I am just a thing you point at something to kill it. I'm not, that's all he can do, so it's just trying to use that for the right ends.
I mean, we've already talked about the locations a bit, but I just wanted to maybe talk about a bit more. Like, I think, as you say, it's partly a budget thing. It's interesting because obviously Cyberpunk tends to be about the city. Noir as well, I think, actually tends to be, to some extent, it's an urban genre, but because of the budget, like, this film obviously can't show you like a future city. The closest we get is maybe in a hotel at the beginning of the film. So it's all these abandoned industrial places all over the world. This final location in Shanglu is obviously made up. So I don't know, do you think that disjointedness, I would say, and like the way it moves between them, particularly this, shifts to like he's going to get revenge for being turned into a robot, and that's suddenly over. And I think that there's a dog that he saves in the beginning of the film that's with him, and you think, oh, that's going to be his buddy. And then I think someone just shoots it and then it's gone. But whatever, there's all these, do you know what I mean? You think it's going to be something and then you're somewhere else. So do you think that like confusion adds something to it in any way?
Definitely, I think so. I think as well, like, you're looking at somebody who has, it's a particular approach with filmmakers of that level or of that style, I would say, almost at level, where, this film, I have to say, like, this is part of a genre of film that everybody's familiar with, like Kickboxer and that kind of stuff. But this is an incredible looking film, right? Like the light and everything, and the way stuff is framed, the way the action sequences happen. It is genuinely amazing that this film looks like this, and you will always see screenshots of it out of context, because as mad as we're making it sound by describing scenes as an aside, the way it looks like the only film ever to live up to its box in the action section of a video rental. It's just bizarre, But I think the approach, or the philosophy I was going to talk about, is you're looking at someone who's trying to make, as well as the best film, the most film. And that's kind of why that disjointedness a little bit is there, because it could be a thing that made more sense, or a plot that was cohered a little bit more, but that looked a tenth of this. And if you're gunning for the market, this guy, you want something that's exciting, memorable. Every film like this, you remember maybe two scenes, but I will say for Nemesis that basically every scene could be one of those two scenes in another film. Be it the scene where they question him in some sort of desert alley that is surrounded by nothing else, on a chair, and where they all look like, like cyber businessmen, and like the guy is trooping through the shitty hotel, and your man, like the classic noir thing of the front desk guy losing his accent when he's talking to somebody he works with or whatever, Yeah, I think the disjointedness, I mean, again, like I covered Mask of Demetrius on my show, which is one of my favorite films ever, and it's about a journalist traveling around the world tracking this criminal or whatever. But one of the things in the film is like, look at these exotic locations, even though they're basically the same room with people wearing different styles of jacket. And like, that is very much embedded in these kind of, that sense of disjointedness. It's the same, like, all noir films kind of feel like they happen at about 3:30 in the morning, and mostly in like non-places, if you like, alleyways or gas stations or whatever. And this is again born of necessity, of this is where you can film, it's going to look like this. But especially like the town Shanglu appears to be a single street in the middle of nowhere. Like he walks down the street when he arrives, and the person he's there to find looks out a window and sees him, and all of the other people come and beat him up at the same point, and something else happens. Like, it knows it's a film, but it doesn't think it's funny, it's a film. But this disjointedness kind of comes from that school, I think.
That works probably unintentionally well as well. This, this cyberpunk idea of like corporations and nations being like almost omnipresent, and the tentacles of capital reaching like everywhere, even in this like little shithole town. It's condensed, so like everyone's there, like all the forces are there. Something I wanted to talk about, which is, I don't know, maybe something of an aside, but just as this film is about, the plot of this film is essentially a conspiracy theory. So as we said, the there's these cyborgs who are replacing humans to try and take over basically and get rid of all the humans, which is, there's these ties in with those conspiracies people have that there are lizards that are in control, like the president's a lizard and the queen's a lizard and whatever, and we're run by lizard men. I just wanted to say something about conspiracy theory based on a Frederick Jameson quote, and he said that conspiracy theory and its garish narrative manifestations must be seen as a degraded attempt through the figuration of advanced technology to think the impossible totality of the contemporary world system. So I just think that there's always something interesting about conspiracy theories, that they grasp at this vague idea that they, whoever they are against us. Like, people can instinctively sense it in a way, and it often gets degraded into these like racist conspiracies about Jews and secret societies and so on. But it taps into a kind of political potential that people instinctively understand that somebody's against them, even if they don't understand it. And the conspiracy plotline always taps into that. That's just something I've wanted to mention as it came to mind.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, right? Because thinking more about how the head cyborg becomes evil, wants to kill all the humans because androids are actually humans, so are human in another sense, not in a literal sense, so deserve better, but does that, ends up embodying the worst of humanity and creates this conspiracy and whatever, because my friend Mark, I guess I can call him my friend, Mark, wrote this article for The Guardian the other week about New Zealand.
I got halfway through that. I want to go back and finish that. That was really interesting. It
contains a very good paragraph about trying to drink an entire lake apart from anything else, which is, if you write anything, will make you incredibly jealous because you're never going to write that. But it's about the PayPal guy who isn't Elon Musk, right? Peter Thiel, and buying land in New Zealand, and how this is very interesting to me. A lot of these Silicon Valley guys have, because I think hacker culture is so informed by Cyberpunk, right?
Yeah. Sure.
And that's so informed by these conspiracy theories that these Silicon Valley guys, even though they're the people at the top, right? Yeah. They win, like they have all the money, are invested in all of these extremely strange contingency plans, and are actually trying to enact conspiracy theories, or think they're happening to them, or have
I think like cultural Marxism, like conspiracy to like undermine.
Yeah, and they're convinced that this is all gonna, and like Peter Thiel, he's building this bunker or whatever, and he has this massive 400 and something acres in New Zealand, and part of this, of course, is also because he's obsessed by Lord of the Rings, so this tendency of conspiracy theories to take what's in front of you, as you said from the Jameson quote, right, you're kind of ambiently aware that you're being conspired against in some way, but also the anti-socialist, so anti-capitalist rhetoric you've maybe taken on means that you can't think of it that way, but you kind of try to come up with something. That like the same thing has sort of happened where, like, you see these guys on top now, these Silicon Valley guys who are like Elon Musk. He is in a situation where he can't think he's the bad guy. Like, you're looking at someone being unable to realize he's the bad guy, to the extent that he like has a load of cultists basically believing it on his part as well. Like,
he thinks he's going to save the world, and people believe him.
Yeah, they do. I mean, Elon Musk is the first, like, there are plenty of millionaires that fall into, like, different billionaires that fall in, like, I don't know, The Simpsons or whatever, like the kind of way people caricatured billionaires. But I think Elon Musk is the first 2000 AD billionaire, because he has such a weird set of beliefs and people are so uncritically believing in his same thing. And he aspires to something so both surface and also silly, and like selling flamethrowers to people and stuff. Like, it's that belief. Funny. Yeah, like you are seeing the same logic that concocts conspiracy theories, concoct these inane, horrific attempts at social engineering by these impossibly moneyed nerds, like that. And a lot of them are post-humanists. Like, Mark's book is about post-humanism and guys who want to freeze their heads and Roko's basilisk and shit like that. Like these bizarre expandings of this theory, or this way of thinking.
So basically, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk are Farnsworth is the conclusion.
Yes, yeah.
Let's try and talk a bit maybe about the film's representation of women. I mean, I think probably, it's a B movie, and in some sense, they've been put there to be looked at, particularly Julian, I think is her name. But, they do also play all the leading roles in the Resistance, and they're the ones that have uncovered the truth. And they're the only cyborgs we see that are not defined by what they've been produced to do, if you know what I mean. They're the only ones that rebelled and left the police voluntarily. They are also gradually killed off to leave a man in charge of kind of a subordinate I don't know how old she's supposed to be. Like, she acts like a child. I don't know if she's supposed to be.
Yeah, and her name is like, what's her name again? Like Nuclear Assault or something? She has some bizarre name, the ending sidekick. She's called.
Was she meant to be? What was she putting on like a weird accent? Like, I couldn't tell if she was putting on like a racist.
Yes, she starts saying San. She's the responsibility for San arbitrarily making its way into the film, I think.
Was she supposed to be Japanese, or I don't know?
I don't know. I don't think so. I thought that was just kind of standard cyberpunk Orientalism. I might be wrong. But
she also spoke with like a weird, I don't know, probably she was trying to do a specific accent and she failed whatever she was trying to do.
Yeah. periodically the main antagonist does an Arnold Schwarzenegger impression and then stops in terms of accent, and it's totally different from the accent they speak in for the rest of the film. So there's a lot of that going on, but that arbitrariness is not just applied to accents, it's applied to, as you said, like it eventually becomes a very rote structure for a kind of an action film where there's a guy and there's a subordinate woman and stuff. But you're right, like the huge amount of the key players of the film are women, or women robots with men's names kind of thing, or traditionally male names or gender neutral names or whatever, like Jared and Julian and stuff, and I thought, what's your man's name again? Max Rain or whatever is the name.
Alex Rain?
Alex Rain, that's Alex again, which is like, right. So it is an interesting film when it comes to that, especially when you see like it sort of goes both directions, where at once Thomas Jane, who was not famous at this time, which is why he's a minor part in this film, has a cameo in this where he's basically totally naked and then gets beaten up, or killed, I think maybe, which would be kind of a standard genre film thing to do to a woman, and she instead is kind of in control of the situation. She holds the fort while the guy runs the head. She has the dramatic death and whatever. And of course obviously as well, the pornographically violent death where her eyes get scooped out, and the lead antagonist hilariously said, "Your memory has already been wiped," which is again incredible. And like attaches wires to the end of her body as it's melting or what. But again, I think it's using its arbitrariness. It is intentional, I think, that. And it's, again, using its arbitrariness for good. And if this is the movie series, if the movies, I just want to make 100% sure, that if the movies I'm thinking of that came after this are correct, it was, the following films were all, the star of them was a female bodybuilder, I think, named Sue Price.
Okay.
So and she kind of, again, there's a lot of kind of ambiguous gender stuff in the following films as well, And I think part of this comes from this sort of ultra fit person culture, like bodybuilding culture or whatever, where even though you would think it's kind of turbo masculine, and it is to an extent, but the sort of aesthetics that are prioritized by bodybuilding and whatever means that the usually gendered, kind of ways people would scan as attractive and whatever in films might not apply to the same extent. So.
I was thinking it's interesting that I think all the women in this, maybe, or most of the women in this are cyborgs. And like coming off the back of Ghost in the Shell as well, it's interesting that women are so often used as the territory on which that, this post-human thing's explored, I think, which again was, you can go back and listen to the Ghost in the Shell episode if you haven't heard it, but I mean, there's something powerful in that, liberatory in that, because like the cyborg, represents something new, sort of breaking boundaries, which is obviously why it's so often mapped onto women who are breaking boundaries, but also problematic, I think, in that you have this thing a lot in films where women are basically used as like symbolic territory rather than people.
Well, definitely. I mean, I think it's a fairly standard thing in sci-fi films that the implied aim for a female character would be to be forever desirable, and the implied aim for a male character would be to be a brain in a computer, because at their basest element, one's a giant intellect and the other is a desirable object or whatever. Again, the woman in the calculator subverts this in Nemesis by being in a calculator, whereas the highly aggressively aestheticized main character Alex Rain is basically shown as this ultra desirable invented, created physique throughout. So I guess that's another way in which this film does its best. I think that is interesting, actually, honestly, for a lot of those genre films that, people said, it used to be these guys, these skinny guys that could act, and now you have these muscle-bound heroes or whatever. But there was, less so now, but there was this period where the pure aesthetics of male physique or whatever and the the advances in steroids really helped with this, I think, as well. Entered this kind of interesting arbitrary zone when it came to where the camera went and how it depicted certain kind of bodies and whatever. But you are definitely right in sci-fi that it's the same. There's a very good interesting piece of writing. I can't remember who wrote it now. I know it's anyway. Sorry, excuse me. About the black body in science fiction and the implications of black superheroes always having electricity powers, which is not something you think about. And if you do know a lot about superheroes, it is a bit of an oh shit kind of thing. And also the willingness to show eviscerated black bodies, like Cyborg, who is obviously the black character in Justice League. The first thing you see him as is a corpse, and is kind of built back together or whatever. And this sort of these ways of the ways that obviously almost all fiction tends to treat white male as default person, the every person that stuff actually happens to and has agency, and everybody else has these roles. And that, I think that's definitely, what you're talking about with the female there, and it applies to kind of black bodies as well. And stuff.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure how to sort of wrap this up, so I'll just kind of try to, I think, summarize the argument that you've made that comes through in this film, which is that the dystopia is not so much that androids are coming, it's that we're becoming androids through these systems that are trying to instrumentalize us and extract value from us. And unless have I missed anything?
No, but I would urge people, especially I imagine people who listen to this podcast are probably the kind of people who read books and stuff, not the people who listen to my podcast. But I would still urge you, especially if this film looks stupid or sounds stupid, which it will if you're not used to seeing stuff like this, to just on an aesthetic level, this is an incredible looking film and is so of its time and so totally unlike something that would be delivered today without irony. There is no irony in this film at any stage, and for good or ill. And I would encourage you to watch it. But as I said, it's not for everybody. But I think it's worth seeing it as a springboard for those ideas as well. And the name that I kept trying to remember of the female character was Max Impact.
Okay, there we go. I think it's so you would think that a film that's this silly would be very easy to engage with, but I think it's actually I found it kind of difficult for that reason, because I wasn't expecting it to be so, to have these ridiculous lines and be so, low budget and B-movie-ish. And when I started trying to engage with it very earnestly, which is probably not the right way to do it. But you can see this other stuff is there if you engage with it in the right way, I think. So, Sean, would you like to tell people about your podcast?
Yeah, so if you liked the last hour of conversation, the less interesting parts, which is the parts I said, have its own podcast called All Units, where I have All Units and Calling All Units. Basically, every 2 weeks I take two films that are thrillers and kind of use them to examine a particular concept. I've done a number of series. I've done a whole series on work and intoxication, and we're doing navigation at the moment, which is how people navigate through reputation or the legal system or grief or trauma. So kind of take two films and see how the best film criticism is other films, right? So that kind of informs the podcast and kind of guiding you towards that. And every other week I just talk about whatever. I've had episodes recently about the kind of culture on YouTube and the wider internet culture, and yeah, I do a lot of stuff about how like all the files are going to go and nothing's going to exist anymore and whatever, and like techno-apocalyptic stuff. And so yeah, it's there's definitely something for some people, and it's short, mercifully, unlike the usual 3 or 4 hour podcasts you get now. So I don't presume upon too much of your time, and yeah, it might be worth listening to. So.
I very much recommend people listen to it. I am not just being nice about the podcast. I listen to every episode. It's really good. And you don't need to be some film buff or anything. I'm certainly not that. And the episodes are still incredibly interesting, even if you've not seen the films, as I have hardly seen any of them. So, but yeah, thank you very much for coming on, Sean.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed this podcast, and I was happy to lower the tone once again for an episode. So.
That's the end of my conversation with Sean about Nemesis. I hope you enjoyed it. I usually ask for iTunes reviews at this point, just to explain why. I don't entirely understand how iTunes works myself, but I understand that reviews play a very important role in terms of the visibility of the stuff that's shown on there that comes up when people are looking around. So that's why I ask for reviews. So if you could take the time to give me a quick review on iTunes, if you're on iTunes, that will make a difference in terms of the exposure the podcast gets, and hopefully you'll get more people listening, which would be great. So I also have a Patreon at patreon.com/Utopian Horizons to help me cover the hosting costs and stuff, and just make it more sustainable in terms of the amount of time I spend doing this. So if you are able to contribute financially and would like to give me a quid or a couple of quid or whatever, you can do that at patreon.com/Utopian Horizons. If you've got any feedback on the episodes, any questions, anything like that, you can come into the Discord and chat to me there and other people, or you can email me at utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com. I think I've mentioned Twitter's at Utopian Horizons, Facebook at facebook.com/Utopian Horizons, but I always forget to post on that. So the next episode is going to be on a book called... No, the next episode is probably going to be on Strange Days. Yeah, I think. So yeah, Strange Days will probably be the next one. At least that's coming up. And then there will be an episode on the book The Angel of the Revolution, which is a kind of H.G. Wells-ish era book, I think. I'm reading that at the moment, so that will delay the next Philip K. Dick episode I do somewhat, but I think I've already mentioned the next one I'll do will be the Simulacra, but that's probably going to be a little while. I'll finish reading Angel of the Revolution first. So yeah, Strange Days, Angel of the Revolution, then I don't know, probably the Simulacra or possibly something else. Tom suggested to me in the Discord that I should think about doing something on Afrofuturism, which obviously is a lot of people talking about at the moment with Black Panther and so on. And I think that's a good idea. So I will probably try and do that at some point. But again, I doubt that'll be soon. I've got some other stuff that I've got planned for the podcast to get out of the way first. So I don't know when I'll get to that, but one day I will. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you for the next episode.